They told you it was about religion. They told you it was for God. But what if I told you the Crusades were just as much about gold, greed, and glory as they were about God? Welcome to History Stays Alive, where the past hits harder than a Netflix plot twist. Today, we dig deep into the Crusades, a saga of faith, fire, and full-blown fanaticism. Not the bedtime story version. This is the raw truth. Let's roll. Forget the Sunday school pamphlet. The Crusades weren't just a bunch of pious knights riding to save Jerusalem. Nope. This was 200 years of bloody conquest from 1095 to 1291, driven by politics, power plays, and a pope who knew how to stir the pot. Europe was a ticking time bomb. Feudal wars drained kingdoms dry. The peasantry was restless. Nobles were either broke or bored, and the Catholic Church hungry for influence. Urban II saw the chaos and turned it into a divine opportunity. By dangling the promise of salvation, he redirected the chaos outward, toward the Holy Land. This wasn't just about reclaiming a city. It was a geopolitical maneuver masked as a moral crusade, a divine war, more like a divine hustle, and that hustle would stretch across generations. Armies marched through unknown lands, crossing deserts, freezing in mountain passes, starving, and often killing each other before even seeing a Muslim army. These weren't professional soldiers. They were zealots, criminals, peasants, nobles, merchants, monks, all wrapped in a banner of righteousness. The Crusades became a funnel through which Europe's most restless souls poured into the unknown. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II pulled off a masterclass in political propaganda. He told the crowd of nobles and clergy that their sins would be wiped clean if they took up the cross. It was a celestial get-out-of-jail-free card, and more than that, it was a call to glory. If you died in battle, heaven was yours. He described the East as a land suffering under Muslim oppression. Women defiled, churches burned, Christian blood in the streets. Was all of it true? Likely not. But it didn't matter. The story was effective. Jerusalem became a symbol, not just of religion, but of legitimacy. To control it was to hold a spiritual crown, and Urban knew that if he could unite Europe's violence under one cause, he could consolidate power like never before. What followed was nothing short of a mass migration. Thousands from every corner of Europe took the cross. They sewed red fabric to their tunics, said goodbye to families, and began a journey many wouldn't survive. The First Crusade was a mess. Before the real armies even got moving, a rogue group known as the People's Crusade, led by a barefoot monk named Peter the Hermit, stormed toward Constantinople. This was not an army. It was a riot on the move, starving, undisciplined, and dangerous. Along the way, they committed atrocities against Jewish communities in the Rhineland. Pogroms, lootings, forced conversions, all before they even left Europe. When they reached the borders of the Byzantine Empire, they were more liability than asset. And when they finally crossed into Muslim territory in Anatolia, they were ambushed and annihilated. Then came the real Crusaders, armored, trained, and just as driven. They fought through Anatolia, survived brutal winters, and laid siege to Antioch, a city that resisted for months, until finally falling to starvation and treachery. When they reached Jerusalem in 1099, the brutality was unmatched. They breached the walls and unleashed chaos. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Mosques turned into slaughterhouses. Men, women, children, Muslim, Jewish, even some Eastern Christians were massacred indiscriminately. This was no chivalrous war. This was apocalypse cloaked in faith, and for those who survived, what they found wasn't a paradise. It was rubble. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, established in the aftermath, was plagued with political infighting, disease, and constant threat of reconquest. The Second Crusade, a diplomatic and military embarrassment. German and French forces marched without coordination and were crushed. The only victory, the crushing of a small Muslim-held city in Portugal. The Third Crusade brought legends. Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin. But Richard never even entered Jerusalem, despite a few victories, including the siege of Acre. The crusade ended in a truce, a political draw that pleased neither side. Then came the Fourth Crusade, a moment where the crusading ideal hit rock bottom. In 1204, Crusaders who had pledged to liberate Jerusalem instead attacked Constantinople, the heart of Eastern Christianity. They looted churches, raped nuns, melted down sacred relics, and burned libraries containing ancient texts. This was Christian violence, raw, greedy, and destructive. Why? Because Venice bankrolled the crusade and wanted its debts paid. Constantinople, rich and vulnerable, was an easy target. The betrayal was so severe that it created a permanent rift between Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. The wounds still linger. Later crusades from the 5th to the 9th became increasingly ineffective. Many never reached the Holy Land. Others were routed. The crusading spirit decayed into half-hearted attempts, fueled by economic interests and empty rhetoric. By the end, the dream of a unified Christian empire in the East was long dead. So what did the Crusades leave behind? Trade boomed. Contact with the Islamic world reintroduced classical texts and Eastern knowledge into Europe. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa became powerhouses through trade routes opened during the wars, but the cost was enormous. The Jewish communities of Europe suffered pogroms, sanctioned under Crusader banners. Muslims across the Levant experienced centuries of military invasion and occupation. Eastern Christians, once hopeful allies, became enemies in the eyes of the West. The papacy reached a temporary peak in power, but the moral legitimacy of the Church began to rot from within. The violence, corruption, and failures disillusioned many. Ordinary families were torn apart. Generations of young men marched off to die for promises of salvation and riches that rarely came. Villages emptied, fields were left fallow, economies stalled. Yet the language of the Crusades never died. It was repurposed for colonialism, for nationalism, for political expansion. Terms like crusade and holy war still echo in modern discourse, used to justify interventions and conflicts worldwide. The Crusades weren't just history's longest war over a city. They were a reflection of human ambition, fear, and faith, all twisted together. So the next time someone says, the Crusades were about faith, ask them, faith in what? Faith in empire. Faith in conquest. Faith in redemption. Through blood. This wasn't just a holy war. This was Europe exporting its chaos under a sacred disguise. And history stays alive. Bro!